The office party was the same old scene, stale canopies and half-hearted conversations about spreadsheets. That was until I saw him, a spark of green eyes and a smirk that lit up the dim room. It was Steve, my husband's best friend. We'd always gotten along, but there was an energy in the air that night, something different. "Bored out of your mind?" he asked, sliding next to me at the makeshift bar. Before I could answer, I was already smiling, a genuine smile I hadn't felt in a while. Turns out, ditching work talk for inside jokes and playful banter was way more fun than I realized. We laughed about my workaholic husband, and, yeah, maybe the wine helped my fingers linger a bit too long when he touched my arm. Walking home, that familiar pang of guilt hit me. I always felt a little bad when I craved a spark that my marriage sometimes lacked. Still, that buzz under my skin wouldn't fade away. It wasn't helped by the unexpected ping on my phone. Steve, sending a funny photo from the party. My reply was way too quick, way too flirty. I snuck into bed beside my husband, already snoring softly. He wouldn't have noticed my barely suppressed excitement, but the truth was, I didn't want him to. The next morning, my phone buzzed again. Hiding that smile was harder than it should have been, and even harder to ignore the thrill of starting a dangerous game. I wasn't stupid, I knew better, but suddenly work wasn't the same. It was like everyone knew, the air thick with unspoken tension. Even Ben, the awkward guy from accounting, kept giving me these weird looks. Was I imagining things, or was there something hungry behind that stare? The office break room was never my favorite place, but lately, it felt downright hostile. Whispered conversations cut short the moment I walked in. A pointed look between Ben and Steve set off alarm bells. Did they know? Know what, exactly, I wasn't sure, but that knot of guilt and fear was squeezing tighter in my chest. It started as a harmless excuse, just needing coffee during that afternoon slump. Then it became a routine. A daily escape with Ben to the dingy cafe down the street. The conversations weren't about spreadsheets anymore. We were venting frustrations about work, about our lives, about the dullness seeping into our marriages. It felt thrilling, daunting, and dangerous. One day, his hand lingered on mine as we crossed the street, a jolt running up my arm. It was a silent dare, and the thrill of it mixed with a sickening dose of guilt. He knew how I felt, how desperately I craved that spark I could no longer find at home. The new perfume was a stupid mistake. Too sweet, too floral, not at all my usual style. Yet there it was, clinging to my clothes, a dead giveaway to anyone paying attention. I held my breath when my husband brushed by, but he didn't seem to notice. The relief was quickly swallowed by self-disgust. One evening, I was closing up a report alone at the office. A flicker of movement outside my door had me jumping. Then I saw it. A glint of light reflecting off something metallic in the hallway. It took a few heartbeats too many to realize, a camera. Were they watching? My breath hitched. It was all just harmless flirting, right? Nothing serious enough to warrant surveillance. Panic flared, then cold calculation. Every lingering text, every stolen glance suddenly seemed like evidence. With trembling hands, I deleted messages, cleared call logs, and started spinning every excuse imaginable. My head spun. Had I been this reckless? Was the game over before it even began? I should have ended it, cut Ben off completely after that handhold. But every time I resolved to act normal, his eyes would find mine across the office, a mix of accusation and longing. It messed with my head, kept me off balance, unsure if he was going to expose me or tempt me further. That's when the first text came. No name, just a chilling message. "I see what you're doing." My blood ran cold. Was it Steve, Ben, some jealous coworker, or, in the darkest corner of my mind, my husband? Suddenly, everyone was a suspect. Every sideways glance in the office felt heavy with meaning. I started jumping at shadows, imagining whispers behind closed doors. Was my husband playing dumb, carefully setting a trap? I spent hours analyzing his every move, every word, looking for the slightest change. I couldn't take it anymore. I cornered Steve at the dingy bar we always went to after work. "Is this your idea of a joke?" I hissed, shoving my phone in his face. His smile was stiff, his eyes denying everything, but the flicker of unease was unmistakable. Going home that night, I felt more like a prisoner than a wife. Even the familiar click of the front door lock sent shivers down my spine. I forced myself to smile as my husband walked in, acting like everything was perfect. Dinner was agony. I chattered too much, laughed too loud, and tried desperately to ignore the way he watched me, a strange glint in his eyes. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, made me bolt upright. My own home had become a haunted house, each echoing corner filled with the whispered accusations of my own guilty conscience. The worst part was, I wasn't even sure who I was afraid of anymore, Steve, Ben, my husband, or myself. One more day in that office and I thought I might actually scream. The whispers seemed louder, the stares more intense. I couldn't take it. I needed an out. Any out. My fingers were already dialing in sick before my brain could process what I was doing. Then the suitcase was open, clothes flung haphazardly inside. Just a few days away to clear my head, that was the lie I told myself. That lie carried me to a nondescript hotel on the edge of the city, far from any place I knew. The anonymity should have been comforting, but my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror only made me recoil. Who was this desperate, paranoid woman staring back at me? I should have stayed locked inside, but a gnawing restlessness drove me out. That's how I found myself in the cramped coffee shop, sipping bitter coffee and trying to disappear into a trashy romance novel. That's when I saw him, Ben. My heart lurched. Was this a coincidence, or something far more sinister? Our eyes met, and any thought of escape went out the window. It was like all that fear and tension twisted into a desperate need. We ended up in one of those cheap motels on the edge of town, the kind with curtains that never fully close. There, amidst the stained sheets and flickering neon sign, all my inhibitions vanished. We confessed everything, our miserable marriages, the spark we'd both been missing, the thrill of something so reckless. A boundary wasn't just crossed, it was obliterated. His hands were on me, and for those stolen hours, the guilt, the fear, they melted away. It all came crashing down when I saw her, a woman from Ben's office, staring at us with wide, horrified eyes. In that split second, everything changed. I bolted out of the room, Ben scrambling behind me. Out on the street, every face looked accusatory, every car seemed ready to follow. I never went back to the office, never went home. That reckless weekend turned into a blur of anonymous towns and sleepless nights on granny bus seats. The thrilling escape had become a nightmare, and there was no turning back. The phantom buzz became my constant companion. Every ring jangled my nerves, every unread text filled me with dread. The messages were twisted games, cryptic riddles, ominous warnings, a promise that I wasn't safe anywhere. The worst part was, I wasn't even sure who my tormentor was anymore. Going home was a calculated risk. My husband was there, his hurt masked by a stony silence that was worse than any shouting. He didn't have to ask, he knew something was terribly wrong. His eyes followed me as I moved through the rooms, a predator assessing injured prey. The lies were getting harder to keep straight. Every stumble, every slip of the tongue, tightened the suspicion in his eyes. We circled each other like wary animals, the once comfortable silence now crackling with unspoken accusations. Sleep became the enemy, nightmares jolted me awake, sweat-soaked and trembling. Then came the obsessive search. I tore the house apart, convinced hidden cameras were still lurking. Floorboards were pried up, air vents examined with a flashlight. The more I searched, the crazier I must have looked, even to myself. Everyone was a suspect, Steve, for starting this mess. Ben, who either betrayed me or was in on some sick game. I even began questioning coworkers, analyzing past slights and petty office squabbles with frantic paranoia. The worst part was the isolation. I couldn't confide in anyone, not with this toxic mix of shame and fear swirling inside me. Old friends' messages went unanswered, their concerned voices felt like a world away. The silence of the house became deafening. I started talking to myself, whispering arguments and accusations against the unseen watchers. My reflection in the mirror was a stranger, gaunt, wild-eyed, a ghost of the carefree woman I barely remembered. This was my prison, a twisted punishment for sins I barely understood. How would it end? I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The unraveling was happening too fast. One minute I was scrambling to hide my mistakes, the next my entire world was about to implode. I needed to get ahead of this, seize control, or risk becoming a helpless victim of my own panicked undoing. In the shadowy world of parking garage handoffs and cash payments, I found him, the private investigator. A scruffy man with sharp eyes and a promise he could get answers. It felt like handing my fate to a viper, but desperation always trumps good sense. The next few weeks were a blur. I became my own obsessive stalker, my phone filled with blurry photos of Ben leaving his apartment, of Steve meeting with people I didn't recognize. I even followed my own husband, a sickening knot in my stomach as I observed his painfully mundane routine. The PI's updates were cryptic, whispers of financial dealings gone wrong, a disgruntled competitor, overheard conversations. It was a puzzle with too many pieces, creating a picture that made no sense. It was all wrong. This was supposed to be about misplaced flirtations and petty revenge, wasn't it? Then came the text, from the most unexpected of sources. Sarah, the mousy girl in accounting who'd always kept her head down. I know what they're doing, the message read. It's not what you think. We need to talk. Meeting her in a dingy cafe near the office felt like a scene from a bad spy movie. Turns out, quiet Sarah had eyes everywhere. Office gossip wasn't just about who was sleeping with who, it was about financial schemes, hidden partnerships, and grudges far older and more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. Bit by bit, the truth began to leak out. It wasn't about me, not really. I was just the perfect pawn, a disgruntled wife in a disintegrating marriage, easy to manipulate and exploit. They wanted to destroy my husband, to ruin his business, and I had blithely walked right into their trap. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was the final, cruel twist. My own reckless desires had made me an accomplice to my own downfall. A strange sort of calmness washed over me once the sickening truth became clear. I wasn't just a victim. I was a weapon, expertly wielded against my own life. That realization sparked something cold and calculating inside me. It was time to turn the tables on this twisted game. With meticulous care, I crafted the bait. A carefully worded text, a hint about meeting with my blackmailer to pay them off. Just a touch of desperation, of a woman terrified and broken, but willing to do anything to keep her secrets safe. Of course, I knew there was no blackmailer, only my puppet masters. My performance in front of my husband deserved an Oscar. Tears, choked sobs, a crumbling facade of helpless terror. He might have seen through the act before, but this time he was blinded by something else, a primal, protective fury. Every word I uttered was designed to stoke that anger, to present myself as a victim manipulated by an unseen predator. His reaction was chillingly predictable. He was ready for a fight. The secluded spot I'd chosen, an abandoned warehouse overlooking the city, wasn't for a rendezvous with a blackmailer. It was an ambush. My husband, fueled by blind rage, lay in wait. When the figure finally emerged from the shadows, my gasp of fear was genuine. It wasn't some unknown enemy, but Steve, his eyes glittering with a mix of triumph and a warped, obsessive hunger. For a heart-stopping second, I thought the plan had backfired. Then my husband stepped out, the confrontation inevitable. The accusations, the denials. It was almost a distraction from the true horror blooming in my own chest. Steve had never just wanted to expose a cheater. His desire was far deeper, far more twisted. He wanted to possess, to claim everything my husband had for his own. And I'd been his weapon of choice. The warehouse floor was slick with rainwater, reflecting the flashing blue and red of police lights. Steve was gone, hauled away babbling some half-baked excuse I couldn't even stomach. My husband stood over me, his face a mask of shock and barely contained violence. Yet, the adrenaline buzz in my own veins had faded, leaving a chilling numbness in its place. The aftermath was mechanical, police statements, sympathetic detectives who didn't understand the depth of the betrayal, and the inevitable media frenzy that descended like vultures the moment my husband's name was connected to the story. The house that had once felt like a prison was now a tomb. Every object, every piece of furniture, held the sticky residue of deceit. My husband's apologies felt perfunctory, like he was going through the motions of a heartbroken spouse. Maybe he was, but the hollowness in his eyes mirrored my own. It wasn't even Steve's face that haunted my nightmares. It was my reflection, staring back with accusing eyes. How could I have been so blind, so willing to sacrifice everything for that pathetic spark of attention? The guilt wasn't just for my betrayal, but for my stupidity, my willingness to be used. Everyone had advice, of course. Well-meaning friends whispered phrases about resilience and forgiveness, their voices fading into white noise against the roar of despair in my head. There were lawyers, too, cold, emotionless sharks discussing division of assets as if they were carving up a carcass. I signed papers, numbly agreeing to terms I barely understood. Sleep became a torture chamber. Each night brought a relentless replay of the past months spiraling into disaster. I jolt awake, heart pounding, certain Steve was lurking in the shadows, when in reality it was the shadow of my own destructive choices that loomed over my life. They say time heals all wounds. Maybe it does, eventually. But in those first weeks and months of picking up the shattered fragments of my life, there was no healing, only a relentless ache of regret, a hollowness carved deep into my soul. The plane ticket was booked before I could even analyze what I was doing. Some remote Caribbean island with cheap drinks and blindingly wide beaches. That's where my finger landed on the blurry map. It didn't matter, anywhere felt better than suffocating in the wreckage of my own damn life. The first few days were a blur of forced relaxation. I lay on the burning sand, letting guilt and exhaustion wash over me in waves, just as the tide erased my footprints. Yet, strangely, the anonymity of the sunburned tourists and overworked bartenders was a balm to my raw spirit. I wasn't the cheating life, the ruined woman, I was just another body with a bad sunburn and a half-finished margarita. Alone on my tiny hotel balcony, the stars shockingly bright in the island sky, I found myself drawn into conversations I never would have sought out at home. The old German woman who recounted her life as an escapee, the young backpacker with dreams bigger than his budget, the local bartender who saw every kind of heartbreak play out on his worn wooden counter. An internal battle raged. Was this cowardly, escaping my problems instead of facing them head-on? Yet, with each story I heard, each fleeting connection formed over cheap rum, a tiny spark of something flickered within me. Was it hope, or just the desperate delusion of the self-destructive? The news from home trickled in like a bad signal on a fading radio. Texts filled with legalese about the divorce, an email notification that the house had sold. With each update, it was like the ghost of my old life was finally being exorcised, painfully but necessarily. Then came the call I didn't expect. It was Sarah, the quiet girl from accounting, the one person who saw through the mess and offered, not judgment, but a lifeline. "We need you back," she said, "not to the office, not to all of that, but there's this project, Women Helping Women, and I thought of you." The offer dangled in the air, an escape hatch, but one that led into the unknown. It wasn't about a husband anymore, or a job, or any external definition of who I was supposed to be. The only question left was terrifyingly simple. What the hell was I going to do with the rest of my life? The return flight was booked, but there would be no grand reunions, no tearful recriminations. A tiny apartment with just enough room for me. A job that was barely a job, more like a step into a vast and terrifying new world. It wasn't a solution, it was barely a start. Yet, standing on the cracked concrete of my balcony, a pot of scraggly flowers my sole possession,